Welcome to episode 19 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This is Chris Sandel. So in this episode, what I want to do is a bit of a review for the year. So I spent a lot of my time reading and watching documentaries. This is pretty diverse range of stuff, things that directly relate to health and nutrition through to things that seemingly have no relation whatsoever. And I've heard people talk about experts who are an inch wide and a mile deep, meaning that they know an extraordinary amount about a very narrow topic. And while I think this is great and they have their place, I'm trying to take a different approach. I think there's real value in having a deep understanding about lots of different areas, being able to pull disparate ideas together, being able to make connections between different things and how they fit together. And there's an expression that states that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I don't want to be like this. So I'm trying to read and watch as broadly as possible to add as many tools to my toolbox as I can. So what I want to do today as part of the show is cover my 10 favorite books and 10 favorite documentaries from this year. In the show notes on my site, I actually include everything that I've read and watched this year in terms of documentaries. So I've read 36 books and I've watched 57 different documentaries. There's probably more stuff for both the books and documentaries. This is just all that I could remember when I was looking through my bookshelf and going through my Netflix viewing history. So this is also being recorded at the start of December, so there's another month to go in this year. But anything that I watch after this point, I'll just add to the list for next year and can include it in next year's show of a similar topic. So as I said, I'm going to go through my top 10 books and documentaries. I'm going to talk a little about why I like them. They are in no particular order. So the number 1 isn't any better than number 10. It's just they're the top 10 for the year. What I'll do as part of the show notes is I'll be including links to all the books on Amazon. And this is for all of them that I've read. And I'll include links for all the documentaries, the IMDb page, so you can go and read more about it and possibly watch the trailer. I thought that this would be a good show to do at this kind of time of year, because if people are looking for gifts to buy in terms of books and want to be able to read, they can be doing it this time of year. Hopefully people are getting some time off over the festive season and it gives them a chance to watch some of these documentaries. So let's start with the books. And what I noticed when I looked through my list was I didn't actually read a huge amount of nutrition books this year. A lot of the reading that I do around nutrition is online. It's blogs, it's research papers, etc. So one of the things I want to do for next year is be more active in terms of reading nutrition books. So the first book is Ari Whitten's The Low Carb Myth. And it's a book I'd been waiting for years. It really is just so well researched. It breaks down everything about low carb, about how carbohydrates work within the body, about arguments about how fat works, etc., and looks at all of these different arguments and just shows where the research supports certain things, where the research doesn't support others. It's just such a well put together book. It's something I regularly recommend with clients. It feels to me like the whole low carb thing is getting better in terms of people aren't getting on the low carb bandwagon the way that they used to. Even within the paleo movement, it feels like people are starting to revise their stance around carbohydrates. And maybe this isn't entirely correct in terms of there are a lot of people going down the ketogenic diet route. So maybe people aren't stopping the whole low carb nonsense. But I really like the book. As I said, it's really well researched and just goes through argument and piece of information and just looks at what is supported and what's not. And I also really like Ari. I think he's incredibly unbiased. He's not someone who has an agenda. He just presents what the research shows. And he really feels like one of the good guys in this industry. And I'm a huge supporter of him. I had him on the podcast at the very beginning. He was actually the first podcast show I ever recorded with someone. And I'll link to that show as part of this episode. I highly recommend giving it a listen, and we talk about the book then. But it is a fantastic book. It is the best nutrition book that I've read in a very long time. So highly recommend getting the Low Carb Myth. So the next book is called Intuitive Eating, and it's by Evelyn Triboulet and Elsie Resch, or Rex. I'm not sure how you pronounce her second name. I've been following intuitive eating as an approach for a number of years, but it was only this year that I actually read the book. And I am taking Isabel Foxen-Duke's Stop Fighting Food program. I was actually a guest lecturer as part of that program, and she recommended the book as part of it. And at the very beginning of the program, and said, read this. It forms the basis for a lot of what I think about food. And so I finally got round to reading it, and it's a really good read. It lays out the ways that people can become more in tune with their body, to stop fighting against their body and fighting against food, and start to listen to what it really needs, and goes through this at all different angles, looking at how diet culture affects our relationship with food, how body image issues affects relationship with food, just touches on everything. I mean, for me, it wasn't particularly groundbreaking stuff because I've been talking about this stuff for years, but it was very useful, and it's something, again, that I've started to recommend and use with clients, just because it's this whole idea that I've been talking about for a long time, all in one place, and people can then go through that, and then we can chat about it. So I would highly recommend, if you're wanting to start to listen to your body and wanting to start to appreciate food from this angle, then Intuitive Eating is a really good book that I would definitely recommend checking out. So the next three books that I'm going to look at all relate to disordered eating in one way or another. So the first one is called Wasted by Maria Hornbacher, and it's probably the most honest and revealing account of an eating disorder that I've ever read. It's a memoir, so it follows Maria's life. It starts out of her looking at, from a very young age, looking at parental issues that she had and problems with her parents. It then looks at when she was, I think it was probably 9 or 10, starting to find her way into bulimia and binge eating, and then got into drugs, and then started becoming anorexic. And it's just so well written, and it's hard to understand or believe that this was written by someone who's a 24-year-old or 23-year-old at the time when she wrote the book. Just very insightful. And it's a book that's often talked about as being almost like the Bible for eating disorders. And I can really see why after reading it. With clients, I'm always very conscious about what I get clients to read. And so there's certain things within the book that could be a little bit triggering in terms of talking about weight, or mentioning different things that she would do in terms of hiding her food or did to help to lower her weight. So maybe it might not be the best book for someone to read who is still in the depths of an eating disorder. So maybe for someone who's already starting to find their way out and is on their way to recovery. But with that being said, I mean, nothing is glamorized about it in terms of what she writes about. She's not writing about how this is such a great thing, or writing it from a positive standpoint. It's very harrowing the way she talks about everything that she went through and the misery that it caused, etc. But she just has this most beautiful prose when she writes, and really just describes the hell on earth that she went through for a number of years or even decade. And I found it one of those books that you start reading and you find it hard to put down. And I read it in a matter of days. So I would highly recommend checking out Wasted. The next book was Breaking Free from Emotional Eating by Janine Roth. And Janine Roth is a name that I'd been hearing for the last couple of years. So finally this year I got around to reading some of her books, and I actually read a number of them. So I read this one. There was another one called When Food is Love that I also read. And I really enjoy her message about getting people to stop fighting food by listening to their body. She tells stories a lot about her own experience, and someone who's been or was a dieter all through her life, someone who had real body issues all throughout her life, and so talks about this from her own experience. She also works or does a lot of workshops with women who are going through the same thing, and so she shares the different stories and different things that she said or that they've said as part of those experiences. The book also contains lots of different exercises, so different writing exercises and different exercises for how people can focus on different things, which I think are great. There is a little bit of a sense when reading the book that once people can get over fighting against food and can get over their food issues, that their weight will stabilize, and normally that their weight will stabilize at a lower weight. I'd say this is probably more implied and sort of subtler than other books, but I don't know how well I sit with this idea, because really you don't know what the end result's going to be. But it is a minor issue in the whole scheme of things, because, as I said, I don't think it outright says this too much, and it is a really useful tool and includes, as I said, lots of exercises to help people get over emotional eating. And I'd also add to that, even if someone doesn't think that they emotionally eat, if that's not necessarily their thing, but they just have issues around food, I would still say it's a very good book to read. It's not just for people with emotional eating problems. And then the next book was A Hunger So Wide and Deep by Becky Thompson. And so this is another book looking at issues with food. And while the other two books that I just mentioned are very good for the layperson, this one I would say is more for a practitioner or for someone working in the field. And I say this not because I think it's technical, but because it's more research-based and is less about solutions and more just understanding the bigger picture about what's going on. And the premise of the book is that eating disorders are often presented in a way that it's about white, middle-class women, and it's normally concerned about women trying to control their weight and trying to be thinner. And what the book wants to explore is how eating disorders happen across different sections of the population and for reasons that occur outside of the traditional idea of weight management. And for a long time, I've talked about the fact that eating issues are less about weight and more about a coping mechanism. And this book really displays this in a great way. It interviews different women and uses a lot of the interview transcripts as part of the book. And it's women who are not your typical white, middle-class, heterosexual women. So interviewing women from different ethnic minorities, people who, it was done in the US, but people who come to the US. So there was someone who'd come over from somewhere in Africa, and just looking at all of their different experiences in regards to eating disorders and how they were being used in those different situations. And I'm planning on doing a podcast in the new year based on this book and based on what this book just made me start to think a lot more about in terms of eating disorders and disordered eating, and how much this is a much bigger, broader, more fragmented topic than most people think of. And it's, as I said, not just this narrow thing that affects a very small subset of society. So the next book that I read that I highly recommend in my top 10 is called The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer. And I'm always wanting to understand more about why people do the things that they do and how people tick and why they make the choices that they do, and also why people believe what they do. And this book was a fascinating book looking at how beliefs are formed. And Shermer is the head of Skeptic magazine. So a lot of what he writes about as part of the book is debunking different ideas. So this can be everything from certain conspiracy theories about 9/11 to alien invasions to ESP. It looks at religion and politics and belief around this stuff. But not only is it looking at why people believe more of the far out stuff, it's also looking at why do people believe the common everyday stuff that they believe. And I really enjoyed the book, and it makes lots of great points. And one of the ones that really stuck with me that he talks about a lot is the order of events with beliefs. And that's this idea that beliefs come first and that we find the supporting evidence second. So people come up with a set of beliefs and then they filter the world to really meet the ways that those beliefs can then be supported. And part of the reason that I got this book was I mentioned earlier that I was doing a guest lecture for Isabel Fox and Duke's Stop Fighting Food program. And my chosen topic for the guest lecture was how beliefs are formed and how we can change them. And it's an area I was already pretty familiar with, but I wanted to know a lot more about the topic, and the book was perfect for helping with this. And I'm actually going to use the talk that I created for that guest lecture and doing a podcast at some point in the early year in 2016 in January time with that information. So the next book was In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate. I'd seen Mate interviewed in lots of documentaries about drug laws and the war on drugs. He's an expert in the area of addiction, and he works in Canada, some area in Vancouver. And really the book is a pretty harrowing read in lots of the parts of it, as he shares stories about many of the addicts' lives and what they've been through and his day-to-day life of having to help and work with these people. And him talking about the fact that basically all the people who are ending up within that community where they're drug addicts were children of abuse or children who had these most heartbreaking circumstances, and people who just really had never felt loved or worthy of anything. And you can clearly see as he talks about these situations why someone would turn to drugs, as they were really trying to remove the utter pain that they had felt pretty much for every day of their life. And it looks at the process of addiction and also makes some suggestions about how the situation could be improved. And one of the fascinating parts of it was Gabor Mate talking about his own struggles with addiction, and not the normal addiction that most people think about in terms of drugs or alcohol or gambling, but an addiction where he would be buying classic music CDs. And I know on the surface this sounds kind of weird or strange or doesn't sound like an addiction, but he was talking about he'd have weeks where he'd go and he'd spend like $500-600 or a couple of $1,000 buying CDs where he should be in helping a patient or should be in helping deliver a baby, and instead he's in a music CD looking at more CDs to buy. And it really starts to make you understand about the nature of addiction, and that it's not so narrow in what's going on in terms of it's the substance, but more about the need that someone is trying to fulfill as part of that process. And he's just such a loving and compassionate guy and writes so well on the topic. And so if you have any interest in addiction and what goes on and some of the people who suffer with it, I would highly recommend reading the book. So the final 3 books in my top 10 have nothing to do with helping clients. So 2 are fiction and 1 is an autobiography of sorts. And so much of my job these days is now writing. So I average writing a couple articles a week, And I really want to be a better writer. I want to have pieces that grab people and move people, or at the very least keep them reading. So while I want to research more about specific foods or hormone pathways or body image or disordered eatings, I also want to understand how to better convey this message. So as part of this, I read a lot of fiction and I read a lot of authors with the specific purpose of improving my writing. And to be honest, it's not just about improving my writing. I love reading these kind of novels, and it can make a nice escape from reading purely about health from one angle or another. But I do really try and read a lot to then help me become a better writer. So the first book is The Shining by Stephen King. Obviously not a new book. Most people know who Stephen King is. Most people know The Shining. And one of the people who I follow in internet marketing is a guy called Perry Marshall. He's an amazing copywriter. I love reading his emails from the perspective of how he writes. And he suggested reading someone like Stephen King because he's able to create such fear and tension with his writing, and it is really gripping. And so since hearing this suggestion probably a couple of years ago, I've slowly been making my way through Stephen King's books. And whenever I go into a secondhand bookstore, I'll always look for this stuff because he's normally an author that you'll find in secondhand bookstores. So I've got a big stack of his books that I'm slowly but surely making my way through. So as I said, The Shining is obviously not new, but at this stage, it's my favorite of King's novels. And it tells the story of Jack Torrance, who's an aspiring writer and also a recovering alcoholic who accepts a position as a caretaker for a hotel in the wintertime. And he moves to the hotel with his wife and his son as part of the hotel, or where the hotel is, because the location during the wintertime, you basically get barricaded in, you can't leave. And the book then goes into to tell of the demise and what starts to happen. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because I would imagine lots of people have read it, or if you haven't read it, you've seen the Stanley Kubrick film, which I still haven't watched. But I really enjoyed the book, and I really enjoy Stephen King's writing. And for anyone who does want to learn how to write better, I would also suggest checking out Stephen King's book called On Writing. And On Writing is partly a memoir, partly an instructional book on how to write. I read it last year and I highly recommend checking it out. So the next book is called Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. So Murakami was another author that I'd always heard people reference and talk about. And for my 30th birthday, a friend gave me the Murakami book IQ84, and it was a huge book. It was actually 2 books, and it took me a couple of years to get around to reading it. And I read it last year and thoroughly enjoyed it. So like with Stephen King, I'm slowly making my way through all of Murakami's books. And so far, Norwegian Wood, which I read this year, is my favorite of all his novels. Murakami has a really distinct style of writing. It's quite surreal. He has kind of otherworldly topics. And Norwegian Wood is probably his most normal of all the books that he's written, or at least of all the ones that I've read. And it's about a guy who's looking back on a time in his life in his late teens and early 20s, and about a relationship that he had back then. It's really beautifully written, and I managed to read it in a number of days while I was away. If you do want to check out his work, I would say that this one of the first ones I would suggest reading, just because it is so accessible. But Murakami is slowly becoming one of my favorite authors, and I just love his stuff. So the final book is called Pimp by Iceberg Slim. And it's an autobiography, as said, by Iceberg Slim, who is the pseudonym of a guy called Robert Beck. And it chronicles his life as a pimp in Chicago in the late 1930s through to about the start of the 1960s. It's probably one of the toughest books I've ever read in terms of its content. the way he talks about women being treated and what used to go on during that time as he had his, quote, stable of women. Really also difficult to read, not just because of the content, but also because of the language he uses and the slang that he uses. If you've ever read any of the Irvine Welsh novels, at least for me, I end up reading the whole thing with the best Scottish accent that I can put on, just so I can try and work out what's being said as part of the dialogue. And so I was doing the same thing with this book, although I had no idea what accent I was trying to put on, just trying to decipher what was being said. And in a similar way to Irvine Welsh books, it's incredibly gritty, but gives you this really intense feeling of what it was like back then. And Beck wrote a whole series of books, and I really want to start reading them, just because he's got such a great writing style once you can get into them. But I would say this book isn't really for the lighthearted. It's definitely a tough read. My girlfriend started reading it after me, and she had to stop reading it. She just said it was too violent. It was too horrible to read how the women were treated. But for me as a book, in terms of helping me to write better, it's really helped me, and it's definitely something I want to start reading, as I said, the rest of his books. So that's it for the books. Now I want to have a look at the documentaries from this year. With all of these documentaries, they are pretty much all of them anyway. They were available on Netflix, and that's where I watched most of them. I don't know if they're still available on Netflix. Netflix has a way of keeping things on and then removing things off, so they might not all be there still, but majority of them I would say you should be able to find. With all the documentaries that I'm doing in this top 10, they were the ones that left me thinking after I finished watching them, or they led for me to have discussions with my girlfriend or with other people about the documentary. So some of them aren't necessarily the best documentaries in terms of their winning awards or their most beautifully shot, although a lot of them are. They're definitely the ones that just affected me the most and had me thinking in some way or the other. So the first documentary is called Love Me, and it's all about men who are going on dating sites and are trying to meet Eastern European brides. As part of it, the guys who are then being interviewed for the documentary then go on this big trip to different parts of Eastern Europe, where they travel around and with the company that runs the website, and go to these different events where it'll be in a bar or a dance. I mean, it feels very much like being back at high school in terms of the quality of the dances and what goes on. And so these guys are then going to these dances, and they're connecting with these people online with the hope of ending up with their future wife. And it was a really strange documentary in that you felt really terrible for a lot of these guys who were just wanting to meet someone so desperately. And they were spending a small fortune on this stuff. And every time they would have to send a message to someone through this site, they were being charged. And then every time they would send a photo attached to a message, they were then being charged to be able to download the photo. And there was one of the guys who pulled out a bill or a statement, and he was spending something like $10,000 or $15,000 a year just messaging different people on the site, plus then going on these trips. And it felt very much like a scam for a lot of people, where you were wondering, okay, is these the real women on the other end, or are they're just a room full of people who have set up all of these pseudonyms and found hot photos of women online? And then you then felt really terrible for a lot of the women that these people were then meeting, and they were coming from these very poor countries, and they were wanting to meet guys so they could move to America and have these better lives. And these guys were 20 and 30 years older than them and approaching these girls who are in their early 20s, and it felt really a little queasy. And it was a real eye-opener in terms of how misguided the idea of love was for a lot of the guys. And it felt like a lot of them still hadn't progressed from being teenagers. And there was picking these women from pictures online who looked like absolutely stunning, who were like Scarlett Johansson, and these guys who definitely weren't attractive people, who it just felt very much like, as I said, they were still teenagers, and that they thought the idea of love with just this incredible, beautiful woman. And just felt that their expectations were so off. And it really, for me, led to a long chat. I watched it with my girlfriend, and led to a long chat with us about sort of what love means and what relationships are about, and reflected on our previous relationships. And I associated a lot with these guys, and I had a lot of their insecurities myself in my 20s, and thankfully have got into a relationship and outgrown a lot of them. But I found it a really interesting documentary, so definitely worth giving a watch too. So the next documentary is one called Lost for Life. And so if I said that Pimp was the toughest book that I read, this was probably one of the most difficult documentaries. And it's all about juveniles who are serving life in prison without parole. So that's kids who went to jail, who, as part of their sentence, haven't been given the death penalty, but have no hope for ever being released. And the film, it contains interviews with the individuals as well as the families. And for all of the people who are in this situation, they're all facing their life sentence without parole because they murdered one person or multiple people. And the sad thing was that a lot of the people that these people had ended up murdering were people in their lives who had been pretty horrible to them. So these kids who had been abused and treated horribly, and then ended up killing the perpetrators in often self-defense or just trying to get out of it, to try and get away from their parents or their guardians. And for most of the prisoners who were being interviewed, it was sort of 6 or 10 years since the events and the sentencing. And it was really interesting to see how they were dealing with the situation and how they talked about what had happened. And did they regret it? Were they remorseful? Did they think it was their fault? We like to think of murderers as these monsters, but you then hear these people talk and you get this very different impression, and they seem very much like everyday people, which can then also feel very uneasy. And things are definitely not as black and white as people want to imagine in these situations. And watching a documentary like this, I mean, I have a general sense of daily guilt, and I don't know if guilt's the right word, but it's an acute awareness of how lucky I am to have had the family that I do, to have the upbringing that I do, the friends that I have, the love and the support, and that people believe in me. And you watch this documentary and these people who are now serving life sentences and how different their life was. And it really made me have sort of mixed emotions about being incredibly grateful for what I have, but also aware of the horrors that a lot of people have to suffer throughout their life, and a lot of the time through no choice of their own. And so, a really difficult documentary to watch, but something that really stuck with me for quite a while. So the next documentary was Blackfish, and this is all about SeaWorld and their capture and use of killer whales. And of probably all the documentaries on my list, this is probably the one that's been the biggest breakout hit, or that more people are likely to know about. And so as part of it, it goes all the way back to looking at the first ever capture of a killer whale for an amusement park, and then what's happened going through all the different captures and up to present day in terms of SeaWorld and SeaWorld's other parks. And killer whales, as the name would suggest, are dangerous. And there's been many casualties of trainers working with them, a number of which were caught on film and are shown as part of this documentary. And as time has gone on since killer whales were first taken into captivity, more and more has been learnt about them and their behaviors and their intelligence, etc. And as more of this information is presented, it just seems more and more cruel to be keeping them in the confines that they have. So as an example, each pod of killer whales has its own distinct language. So even if you're putting 2 or 3 killer whales into the same pool, if they're not from the same family, they have no way of knowing how to communicate properly. And so these different killer whales, they would be attacking each other, and there'd be real damage from attacking each other. I mean, they talk about the fact that in the wild they're swimming, I can't remember, it was 100 miles or 100 kilometers a day, but it's a huge amount of distance that they're covering each day, and yet they're then in these tiny pools. And I mean, it made me really think about zoos, and I've been unsure about zoos and uneasy about zoos for quite a while. And I guess for certain animals, there's something vaguely similar to their natural life when they're put in a zoo. But for something like killer whales, there is nothing even remotely natural about what they're experiencing. And it just seems so cruel to have them in the confines. And SeaWorld has been struggling for a number of years. And I don't think that this documentary has done them any favors, and is going to mean that they're going to continue to struggle. And hopefully, it's going to lead to them making some changes, and it has led to them making changes about certain policies that they have. But hopefully, it goes further than what they've done so far. And it's a really well put together documentary, one that left me feeling very angry about the situation. And I'd say it is one of those things. It is a must see. So the next film is called Hot Girls Wanted. And this is a film about the amateur porn industry and young girls who are getting into it and starting to take part. It was produced by Rashida Jones, who's the daughter of Quincy Jones, and is an actress who's probably best known for her role in Parks and Recreation. And so it looked at girls who were getting into the porn industry, and sort of interviewed them and talked about with them, and a lot of them expressed their ideas, or they wanted to do it to make money, and that money would make them feel so much happier, and that they didn't feel like they had a lot of options to be making money. There was a scene where one of them, there's an interview with a porn star, and she's talking about how it's such a strong, empowering thing for a woman, and that there's been this real shift towards equality and women's rights, etc. And then you see how the women are then treated, and some of the things that they're asked to do, and just how interchangeable they are. And really, they're just pieces of meat that are used for a number of documentaries, a number of films, and then they move on to the next girl. And yeah, it didn't feel very much like equality or an advancement. And it really also made me start to think about porn and its accessibility and how that's changed. And I don't have kids, but how it's a whole different situation to when I was a kid, and someone may have a porn in terms of have a magazine versus what kids can access today at their fingertips on the internet. And I mean, I don't have any solutions to any of this, but it really did make me ponder the situation. And it was a really good documentary in terms of just making you think about these different issues and the girls who get into that situation. And is it really about empowerment, or is it something totally different? So the next documentary was called Cartel Land. And this is about the drug wars going on in Mexico and in a specific area within Mexico. And it looked at a group of civilians who formed a vigilante group and were starting to then force the cartels out of different regions and push them back and taking those areas back. It also looked at certain groups of Americans who were patrolling the border, so the border in from Mexico to the US, and these weren't border guards who were being employed by the US government. These were people who were doing it again like vigilantes on their own and deciding that they had enough of people coming into the country illegally, and that they were going to deal with it themselves. And when they found people, they would then contact the government to come and take these people away. There was a real undercurrent of racism by the border guards, even though they seemed to think they were doing it for the right reasons. Some of them being interviewed, it was quite alarming, some of the comments that they would make. But also just looking at what would happen with this vigilante group who started out for all the right reasons and were doing all of the things to support the community, and then how easy it is for that to then just turn, and how easy it is for power to corrupt people. And so by the end, you're seeing this group that was starting out so well basically turning into their own cartel. And yeah, I mean, some very difficult scenes to watch, with stories about people who'd been through just the most horrific things, and their account of what had happened when people were being then picked up and then brought back to be tortured for information. So definitely not an easy thing to watch, but just made me think about how easy life is for so many people versus how difficult everyday life is for lots of others. And just in terms of how power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And just, yeah, seeing people who started out with such good intentions and how it can go so wayward so easily. So the next documentary was called An Honest Liar. And this documentary is about James the Amazing Randi. And so James Randi is an escape artist. He's a magician. He's like a modern day Houdini. He's now quite elderly. I think he's in his late 80s now, or late 70s. And similar to Houdini, Randi is like totally against deception. So it looked at a lot of the fighting and a lot of the things that he'd done throughout his life to stop this deception. So preachers who were telling people that they were hearing the voice of God and were charging huge amounts of money for people to come to these events, and telling them how they were going to be curing them of all these diseases, etc., and how it was a total scam, and they were using radios and had earpieces and whatnot, and looked at Uri Geller and him saying how he could bend spoons and use his mind to bend spoons, and doing ESP, and how Randi was able to show that he was able to do all of the exact same things. And yeah, just very interesting. And how he spent his life rallying against these kind of people and being a big advocate for science. And I've read biographies about Houdini, and I've read Derren Brown's books, and a lot of people who are very good at doing magic, who seem to have powers that are unable to be explained by most people. A lot of the time they are very pro-science, and what they're telling people is that what they're doing isn't anything to do with the occult, or it isn't to do with anything because they have magic powers or anything like that. It's purely magic, purely trickery, and they're happy to admit that. And what they want to do is fight against people who are saying the opposite, that are saying that they're able to speak to the dead, or to directly have God speak through them, etc. And it was, a really interesting documentary looking at his life. And there is, as it goes on, there is a bit of a twist that I don't want to talk about, but really worth checking out. He's a fascinating guy. So the next documentary is, it's called The Internet's Own Boy, The Story of Aaron Swartz. And this is the documentary that probably affected me the most of any that I've watched this year. And I'd seen Ray Peat and Danny Roddy reference Aaron Swartz, but I'd never really known about him and what had happened to him. And so the documentary is about his life and his untimely death. And so Swartz was a genius, a child prodigy who got into computers. And he was involved in the creation of RSS and the Creative Commons. He was the founder of Reddit, or one of the co-founders of Reddit. And he was doing all of this stuff at a tremendously young age. So he was helping to author RSS at the age of 14. He was working on the Creative Commons at age 15. And there's footage of him giving presentations to these roomfuls of people when he's just a kid and you can barely see him over his laptop screen. And just so intelligent. And he became a real activist for social justice and working against the government and the powers that they have. And I see a lot of similarities between Swartz and Edward Snowden. And Swartz believed that information should be available to all and not just the elite. And he was actually arrested for downloading journal articles from MIT. And the charges that were then brought against him were pretty excessive, and he was looking at doing some serious jail time. And the documentary goes through the harassment that was happening to him and other people within his life, and really how badly it was all handled by the government. And unfortunately, on the 11th of January 2013, Swartz committed suicide. And it really, the documentary affected me so much because he was someone who was just such a loving person and had his heart in such the right place. And he didn't care about money, didn't care about material things. I mean, he was someone who could have been worth an absolute fortune, but he instead just wanted to work on things that would really make a difference. And he would be spending his time working for social justice and working to support society and create a better society as he saw it. And it definitely left me with a sense of I really want to be doing more in this world. So I highly recommend checking out the documentary and looking into the work of Aaron Swartz and his story because, yeah, as I said, a really incredible human being. And unfortunately, his life was cut short. So the next documentary is called Montage of Heck. And this is all about Kurt Cobain, who was the lead singer of Nirvana. It's a montage of footage from his life. So it contains different interviews. It contains animation based on a lot of his own artwork. So he used to do a lot of drawings, and so this was used as part of the film. They use a lot of music throughout the documentary, so rare recordings or things that were in the development stage or unreleased material. Nirvana was a band that had a real big impact on me as a kid. It was probably one of my favorite bands growing up as a teenager. I actually discovered them after Kurt had passed away. So he passed away in 93. I was only 12 at the time. So it was probably in 94 or 95 that I discovered their music. And yeah, they had a real big impact on me. And there's a huge amount of nostalgia that I felt watching the film and listening to it. And some of it was very difficult to watch. So he was essentially a drug addict and struggled a lot with heroin. And there's a scene with him with his little baby girl where he's holding her, and his wife Courtney Love is trying to cut her hair with a pair of scissors while Kurt is looking absolutely out of it on heroin. And yeah, not an easy scene to watch, and probably not a documentary that everyone is going to want to watch because it's not your normal documentary. It feels more like a 2-hour music video with bits of information. And so I guess unless you're really into the band or really into music, it's probably not going to be the first documentary you're going to pick. It's a little bit controversial because it doesn't include any interviews with Dave Grohl, who was in the band at the time. There's conspiracies around Kurt's death and whether it was suicide or whether he was murdered. And there's another documentary that's just come out called Soaked in Bleach that looks at the idea that maybe he was murdered instead of it being a suicide. I haven't watched this documentary, but it's on my list. But I mean, Montage of Heck, it painted a picture of someone who's just in a lot of pain, and no matter how much money or fame or appreciation he got, it just didn't help. And I guess it's a message that I talk a lot to clients about, that we have this real idea that external things are going to make us happy, when really it's much more about what's going on inside with people. So yeah, this documentary definitely hit home, and it really gave me a couple of sleepless nights and some very messed up dreams, but worth checking out if you're a fan. The next documentary was Twinsters. And so this is about a female who is South Korean, who was South Korean born, who was adopted by American parents. And she then grew up to be an actress. And one day she received a message from someone saying, you need to check your Facebook messages. And basically she checked her Facebook messages in her other message. I don't know if you know, in Facebook you have your messages from friends, and then there's this whole other messages. So if someone who's not your friend messages you, it goes into this other message inbox. And within that message inbox, she received a message from a girl saying, look, one of my friends was watching your video. He said that you looked a lot like me, so I watched the video. You look very similar to me. I've just checked out your IMDb page. You are born on the same date as me. And basically they started getting in contact, and it turned out that she was also South Korean. She had been adopted but by French parents. And basically, as it goes on, it turns out that they are actually twins, and that they were separated at birth, and they do DNA tests, and that they're identical twins. And it was just such an improbable situation. And I mean, if someone had put it into a real movie as opposed to a documentary, you would have just said, well, it's just too far-fetched. It's totally unrealistic. And so the documentary follows them as they become friends, and they visit one another and go back to South Korea. And it's just really interesting from my perspective for the whole nature versus nurture, because even though they were raised in totally different homes, they are so similar, and similar physically, which maybe isn't that surprising considering they're identical twins, but they would have had very different diets, they would have lived differently, and yet they have very similar body shapes and body types. But it's their mannerisms, their sense of humor. They are so similar, despite the fact that they've spent basically their entire lives not knowing of one another and living in very different environments. So yeah, a really interesting documentary, very easy to watch in comparison to a lot of the other things that I've referenced where it's pretty tough going and difficult. This was nice and a real no-brainer. So if you're looking for something a little easy, then I would definitely check it out. So the final documentary is called Call Me Lucky, and it's about a stand-up comedian called Barry Crimmins, and I'd never heard of him before the film. And Crimmins got started in the 1970s in Boston, and he was a very angry guy, incredibly funny, but had this real rage about him, and super intelligent and aware of what was going on in the world. And one of the interviewees points out that he used to talk about all of these different things that are going on in the world in terms of things that the government are doing in the US or in Nicaragua, and all of this information that he knew in the pre-internet age. And it's so easy for us now to type in someone's name and to pull up a whole heap of facts, but this was a guy who was able to do this back in the 1970s and 1980s when we didn't have that information at our fingertips. And he reminded me a lot of Bill Hicks in his later years. So if anyone knows of Bill Hicks, I mean, there is definitely some comparisons, which is also another really amazing documentary on Bill Hicks, if anyone wants to watch it, called American, the Bill Hicks Story. But yeah, with Crimmins, as I said, he had this anger and this rage, and as it goes on, you discover that he had some pretty horrible stuff happen to him in his childhood. He was sexually abused by a babysitter on a number of times, and it was something that he never talked about until one day he shared it when he was on stage. And then he's starting to process all of this and try and get over it and recover from it, and reaching out to other people who've been abused and really dealing with his recovery. And it's at this stage that the internet's just starting, and he finds AOL and the AOL chat rooms, and finds different chat rooms that are just rife with trafficking of child pornography. And so he starts to immerse himself and just spent months and months of this, going into this stuff, where he's collecting evidence and he's taking this evidence to AOL and to the police, and finally ends up going to the Senate, and he becomes responsible for the first pedophile arrests using online evidence and having laws be enacted because of his work. And just really interesting. I mean, someone who must have put themselves through just the most horrible situation to see pictures and see things that you can never unsee, to make a better world and to try and get people out of these situations. And I mean, he's very much against a lot of American politics, are very anti-Reagan and anti-Bush, and definitely paved the way for a lot of people today that we see as comedians like Jon Stewart and Bill Maher. And I found a lot of similarities between Crimmins and Aaron Swartz in terms of very much working and continuing to work for social justice. And again, like the Aaron Swartz documentary, it was one that's really sat with me for quite a while and had an effect on me. So yeah, really suggest that Call Me Lucky, that you check it out. So that's my reviews for the year. Hopefully that gives you some suggestions for things to watch or read over the holiday period. As I said, the show notes, I'm going to include links to all the books and all the documentaries that I've watched this year. They're all worth checking out. I read a lot of reviews before I read or I watch something. So it's rare that things turn out to be a dud. So you can go through the whole list of documentaries that I've watched or the whole list of books, and pretty much all of them are of a good quality, and I would highly recommend watching. It was really difficult for me to whittle things down to just top 10s for each of these lists. So things that didn't necessarily make the top 10 doesn't mean that they're no good. So that's it for this show. I hope you have an enjoyable week, and I will catch you next Thursday when I have another guest on the show.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.